Good afternoon, I'm Eytan Wallace with USA Annenberg Media, and today I'm honored to be joined by the esteemed Joel Grover, investigative reporter with NBC4. Joel, thank you for taking the time today.
It's great to be with you.
Thank you, Joel. So the first question is about your childhood and where you grew up and when you first got into journalism.
I grew up about 10 minutes from where we're standing right now in Van Nuys, went to Grant High School, went to Milliken Junior High in Van Nuys too. And I think it was in junior high school, we had a junior high newspaper, that I just got bitten by the bug. I knew I wanted to be a journalist. And by the time I was in high school and we were allowed to dream up any projects we wanted for the high school paper, I started to get really interested in investigative reporting. I think I was in junior high and high school in the Watergate era. Woodward and Bernstein. Truly, watching them break the Watergate story was such an inspiration to me and to a lot of people of my generation. I think that was my inspiration to become an investigative journalist at a very young age.
Wow, and so once you went to high school, and then when you went to college, when you were an undergrad like me, did you major in journalism or no? And if you'd explain why, and I know you went to UC Berkeley,
Right.
So if you could go on with that.
I went to UC Berkeley. They do not offer an undergrad major in journalism. Their philosophy is if you want to be a journalist, get a good education, major in something else, and then go on and get a graduate degree or work in the business. So when I was an undergrad at Berkeley, I worked for the Daily Californian, the newspaper, and I actually started pitching a lot of investigative stories. And I did some in college for the student paper.
Wow. So after college then, you decide that you want to go into broadcast journalism, and your first job is in Grand Junction, Colorado.
Actually, when I was in Berkeley, I looked at different types of journalism. That was the era when weekly news magazines like Time and Newsweek were huge. I thought maybe I can be an investigative reporter for one of them. I was fascinated with newspapers. I grew up reading the LA Times every morning from the time I was very, very young. I looked at everything. And then my last year of Berkeley, I did an internship at the public television station, which was not a typical news station, but there was something about the visual medium of television news that really grabbed me. And I said, this is what I want to do.
Wow, that's amazing. So speaking of television news, if we could go now into your career, you began in a very small city and ended up in Los Angeles. If you could just take us down your career path and how you ended up as an investigative reporter for major stations.
Right. When I got my first job in 1982, there was really only one path if you wanted to be a television reporter, and that was you started in a small station. So I just wanted to get working. So I sent out my tape to a bunch of stations throughout the Western United States, and I got a call from a news director in Grand Junction, Colorado, which I'd never even really heard of before I sent them the tape. And he said, I like your tape. I'd like to hire you as our reporter. There was only going to be one reporter on their staff, but you have to agree to be the weathercaster also. That was the deal. So I said yes, and I jumped at the chance. And I have to tell you, my first job was probably the hardest job I've ever had, because I would get in the morning, I would have to cover 3 stories that day, shoot them, edit them myself. Then I would have to do a weathercast on our 5:30 news and then one on the evening news at 10. My first job in TV was probably the hardest job I've ever had. I was the only reporter on staff, so I was responsible for covering 3 stories a day, shooting them, editing them, writing them myself. I remember those days from the moment I walked in to the moment I left at 10:45, 11 at night. I don't think I ever stopped and ate a meal sitting at a table. It was always eating on the run, eating while I was writing or editing. It was non-stop.
Wow, it's non-stop. And so that's amazing. So then from that job, you slowly took the route of going to bigger cities, Cleveland, right?
Well, back then, the standard path for a TV reporter back then was you kept climbing to a bigger market, slightly bigger market, another market. So I went from Grand Junction to Las Vegas, to Salt Lake City, to Cleveland, to Minneapolis. And finally, my goal was always to come home to Los Angeles as an investigative reporter.
And look where you are now. That's amazing. You made it. So with that said, we talked about where you, how you grew up, what inspired you to go into journalism, and your career. If we could talk about your Who's Watching the Store piece when you were in Minneapolis. It won a Peabody Award. Talk about the piece in general, if you could just tell a little bit about it, and how did you even think to do such a piece?
I learned a great lesson from doing Who's Watching the Store. The idea for that story came from the cleaning woman, the woman who cleaned our television station in Minneapolis. She was an African-American woman. We were friends. I would stop and talk to her all the time. One Monday morning, I saw her in the station. I said, "How was your weekend?" And she said, "I'm still angry from what happened to me this weekend." I said, "What happened?" She said, "I went shopping and I had $500 cash in my purse to buy clothes. And every store I went to, I was watched and followed by security guards just because I was black." And I was stunned. I'd never heard of that. I said, "Is that common? Has that ever happened to you before?" She said, "As a black woman, that happens to me every time I go into a major retail store." So a light bulb went off in my head and I thought, there's a story here. So I started to research the security, the retail security industry. I talked with some experts and consultants in that industry, and they said, yes, it is a standard practice. This was 1990, that retail security guards are trained to watch minorities, even though most shoplifters are Caucasian. So I learned a great lesson in pursuing that story, that some of the best stories come from just listening to the everyday experiences of everyday people.
What an amazing lesson. And then you won a Peabody with that, and what came out of that story?
And a DuPont and an Emmy, but I don't want to brag. Oh my gosh, I did so many follow-up stories. This was 1990, 91 when it aired. That story sparked a huge outcry in Minneapolis, the Twin Cities area, from the minority communities. And they were so happy that this story finally exposed a discriminatory practice that had been going on for many, many decades. I remember the week after that story aired, African American churches throughout Minneapolis and St. Paul handed out buttons for their parishioners, their congregants, to wear that said, "I am not a shoplifter." So for quite a while after our story, people of color were going out and shopping wearing buttons that said, "I am not a shoplifter." There were some major changes in some of the retail chains that we exposed in that piece. And I also remember a couple of major retail chains across the nation called me up and said, "We are going to use your story from now on to train our security guards what not to do, how never to discriminate." So I feel like that story made a nationwide impact.
Wow. Let's now move on to your Los Angeles days. You started at KCBS and you came right here to KNBC. When you were at KCBS, you conducted a story called Behind the Kitchen Door. And I don't need to explain, I would like you to explain, but it basically exposed some fancy restaurants and all sorts of restaurants that were breaking major health code violations. How did you hear about this story? What got you into doing this, and what resulted from it?
I was a brand new investigative reporter in Los Angeles, and I had a pretty good tip from a childhood friend who had become an LA County health inspector, who said to me, "You need to investigate LA County's restaurant inspection system. It is corrupt, it is broken, and it is allowing restaurants, some of them very well known, to be filthy and get away with it." And then I knew a couple of restaurant owners that I could confide in, and I asked them, "What do you think of the restaurant inspection system in LA?" And these were restaurants, I think, that did it right and were very serious about following the health code. And I remember one restaurant owner said, "I spend thousands of dollars a year to keep my kitchen clean and follow the code, but there are restaurants all the way up and down Ventura Boulevard in the Valley that break the law and get away with it, and it's wrong." Those two conversations with the restaurant owner and the health inspector made me think there's a story here. So we pursued a story, and I want to tell you, when I first pitched this story to my bosses in LA, they said, that's an old story. People in this market have been doing dirty restaurant stories for years. I said, I'm not doing another dirty restaurant story. We're going to take a close look at the government system that inspects restaurants. And we're going to do it by doing an incredible record search, following a paper trail of health inspections going years back. And I think we should send undercover people in restaurants we identify as having bad inspection records. And by the way, when I pursued that story 20 years ago, restaurant health inspections in LA County were being kept private, confidential by the county. They didn't show them to the public. That, of course, all changed when I did this story.
And it resulted in the grading system. Are you able to go into just briefly what the grading system is?
This was, again, one of the stories I've done that had an immediate impact. It created a public outcry in LA, which I didn't expect, and certainly none of my bosses expected at the time. People were outraged at some of the undercover video images we got in dirty kitchens. And they were calling their politicians, city councilmen, county supervisors, and saying, you're putting everyone in danger, do something about this. And I knew about this outcry because the politicians were calling me, a reporter, and saying, come talk to me, I'm going to do something to make the restaurant inspection system better. So there were two county supervisors that approached me at the same time saying, we need to develop a letter grading system and put it on the doors of restaurants so the public will know if a restaurant they're going to is clean or dirty.
And that's what we see today, A, B, and C on those restaurant doors. You have also done similar related produce stories with KNBC, including the produce market. Are you able to just expand on what that story touched upon?
You know, covering food safety has been a passion of mine as an investigative reporter. I've covered a lot of different angles of it. So when I came to KNBC, which is 14 plus years ago, I continued to look at the health department's inspection system and do a lot of stories on that. Then I got a tip in about 2009 about something called the 7th Street Produce Market, which was a huge wholesale produce market that supplied produce to restaurants and markets across Southern California. And the tip was the place was filthy, infested with rats who were eating produce that went to supermarkets and to restaurants, that there was raw sewage falling on food that again would go on to restaurants, lots of health code violations. And the most important part of the tip I got was that the health department had been alerted about this for years and turned a blind eye to it. So we decided to pursue that story again by following a paper trail of inspections and by documenting it with undercover cameras.
And what impact did that story have?
The health department was tremendously embarrassed by that story, embarrassed into taking action finally. What we got on camera, hidden camera, which we didn't inspect, was once the health department learned we were doing a story about the 7th Street Produce Market and its filthy conditions, they sent supervisors out there to warn everyone at the market, clean up, NBC is doing a story. They should have done that years earlier, and we got them on hidden camera, doing the job they should have done earlier, and doing it only because the media was exposing this. So the county went to the owners of this market and said, we're gonna shut you down or you clean up. And they cleaned up.
It goes to show you the power of the media. And my final question, what advice do you have for aspiring journalists and investigative journalists?
I'm gonna repeat something I told you earlier. I think you need to be a good listener. You need to train yourself to be a good listener and talk to everyday people about everyday experiences, because a lot of the best investigative stories I've done come from experiences of people, experiences they just want to share with me. And I also find that a lot of the best stories I've done are right there in plain sight, but most people, most reporters miss them. So Listen to people all around you all the time. Look at your surroundings, and sometimes you will just hear and stumble upon the seeds of a really great investigation.
Wow. That's a great way to conclude. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think that's it.
All right, Joel, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate that today, and that's going to conclude our interview.